Okay.
This is a pretty historic mission. Artemis 2 is the first time that humans have flown to the moon since 1972, so it's been 54 years. I will get into the reasons as to why that is the case over the course of this presentation. But there's a lot of big firsts for this mission. So we broke a record for the farthest distance traveled from Earth. We sent the first woman to the moon, we sent the first person of color to the moon, and we sent the first non-US citizen to the moon. So lots of big firsts on this mission, and this is just the beginning. So Artemis 2 is an extended test drive of the Orion spacecraft, which is our new deep space exploration vehicle, hopefully with many new missions to follow after this. If somebody can let them in, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, so the number one question I get from people about this is, why have we not gone back to the moon until now, since 1972? What's the deal? So I'm sure everybody's familiar with the Apollo program. That was the series of moon landings that occurred in the 1960s. That was in the context of the Cold War, with the US competing with the Soviet Union to land the first person on the moon. And we won the space race, as it was called, when we landed people in 1969 with the historic Apollo 11 mission. NASA had grand plans for what they were going to do after that. They said, great, we've proven out the technology, we've landed people on the moon, now we can do all this cool stuff. So the plan was to build a space station in Earth orbit, a reusable space shuttle to get people to and from the space station in Earth orbit, a reusable nuclear-powered spacecraft to get people from Earth orbit to the moon, a space station in lunar orbit, a permanent lunar base, and then sending people to Mars in nuclear spacecraft by 1986. That was the plan. They had this all worked out, pretty detailed plan. Richard Nixon, then president at the time, was dealing with a lot of stuff. We had the Vietnam War going on. He had some personal issues, which later became widely known through the Watergate scandal. And he basically took one look at this and said, okay, I'm willing to pay for one of these things. So you got to pick one element of this overall plan. And what this was called was the Space Transportation System Integrated Program Plan. NASA kind of put their heads together and said, okay, if the government's only going to pay for one of these things, we got to pick something that will enable us to do the rest of it later. And so they picked the space shuttle as the one element of this overall plan that would be funded. And so interestingly, the space shuttle is actually officially called the Space Transportation System because it was the only remaining surviving element of this whole overall plan. So that was the 70s. In the intervening years, we did succeed. Yes?
Can you explain the logic behind the nuclear spacecraft? Because that doesn't really provide propellant that you need to get to Mars. So why were they so obsessed with that energy system?
Yeah, so the question was, why were they considering nuclear propulsion for in-space vehicles? The reason for that is it is actually still a more efficient mode of transportation than traditional chemical rockets. So NASA had a program in the late 60s and early 70s called NERVA, which was an acronym for their nuclear engine. And the way that nuclear thermal propulsion works is it uses the extreme heat that's created by the reactor to boil off the hydrogen propellant and expel it through the nozzle. And so the advantage of that is that you can just use pure hydrogen as your fuel, as opposed to having to carry an oxidizer that would combust the hydrogen as happens in a traditional chemical rocket. And so that means that you can carry a lot more fuel that's effectively useful in the same vehicle, as opposed to having to carry fuel and an oxidizer. So the sort of measure of efficiency for a rocket engine is a term called ISP, or specific impulse. You can think of that as like MPG for rockets, essentially. The best that we can get with traditional chemical rockets is about 460. The NERVA engine in the 1960s was able to achieve over 900 ISP, so it was twice as good as a traditional chemical rocket. This technology was kind of put on the shelf, but it's now coming back. So DARPA has put out a challenge for industry to develop new nuclear thermal propulsion engines for space. It's particularly useful for Mars missions because that can help us cut down the transit time. With traditional propulsion, a Mars trip is a 9 to 18 month journey one way to get to Mars. And nuclear propulsion will still make it a several month journey, but it will cut down on that significantly. So that's the advantage to that. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Yeah.
Cool, yeah. Okay, so this is what they were trying to do. The idea was to have a fully developed industrial ecosystem in space, which would support all kinds of industries like energy and mining and manufacturing and all exploration. And it was a great idea. All of this is technically feasible. There's nothing about this that was really out there from an engineering perspective. It was out there from a budgetary perspective. So we did get a reduced scale version of this. So the space shuttle was successfully introduced into service in 1981. Space shuttle served from 1981 to 2011 with 135 missions. As we all know, it wasn't completely successful. We did have two tragic disasters, the Challenger and Columbia disasters, in which both of the crews were lost. But the space shuttle was still a remarkable achievement. It was the first reusable spacecraft that could go back and forth. The Discovery, which is this one in the picture here, is called the Queen of the Orbiter Fleet. And the Discovery flew to space 39 times, which was unprecedented for a crew or really any kind of spacecraft. And using the space shuttle, we were able to build with global partners the International Space Station, which was another element of that overall plan. So I mentioned that they thought they might be able to do some of it later. That was what they were able to accomplish. So ISS was built over a long period of time, starting in 1998. They finally finished it in 2011. They're still actually adding little pieces to it here and there as the occasion arises. But this was a remarkable achievement of post-Cold War cooperation between the United States and Russia, as well as several other countries. So Europe is involved. The European Space Agency has the Columbus module, which is that one right there. This one with the thing hanging off the bottom is the Japanese module. So there's a lot of different countries involved in the ISS. But unfortunately, the ISS is beginning to reach the end of its life. So it's basically slated to retire in 2030. So we're getting close to that end, unfortunately, for the ISS. So with all this going on, NASA was trying to think, okay, what do we do next? Now that we have the shuttle, now that we have the ISS coming together. And so in 2004, the George W. Bush administration came up with this plan called Project Constellation. And the joke was they called this Apollo on steroids. The idea here is that they would use these two rockets called Ares 1 and Ares 5, which were derived from shuttle components and hardware, and basically go back to the moon like Apollo, but a little bit beefed up. So bigger vehicles, longer duration stays, more robust architecture. And part of this program were two vehicles called Altair, which was the planned lunar lander, and then another vehicle called Orion, which was the crew capsule. And so that was the plan under Project Constellation, which, like I said, started in 2004. In 2009, they did the first test flight of Ares 1. This is called the Ares 1X flight. The only actually live part of the rocket was this first stage, the really skinny part. The upper stage was a dummy, so it's basically a mass simulator, so it effectively mimics what the flight characteristics would be, but it doesn't have any actual engines. So they successfully test flew this in 2009. There were issues with this design. The biggest one is it had something called pogo oscillation. And so that means that it's kind of like a pogo stick in terms of its vibration characteristics. And so if you are an astronaut, in the top of it, you're going like this the whole time in the flight. And that's really not good for the astronauts. So that was a problem. NASA spent a lot of money trying to figure out how to fix that problem. And then, as I'll tell you in a second, this whole project ended up getting canceled. So that technology did end up getting used to earthquake-proof buildings, so it wasn't a total waste. But that was one problem with this. The other problem was that it was way behind schedule and way over budget, like almost every space program in history, with a few notable exceptions. And it was also 2009, which, you know, for those of us with relatively long memories, was the Great Recession. And so there was a lot happening at the same time. There was a group called the Augustine Commission that was put together by this guy, Norm Augustine, who had been in charge of Lockheed Martin. They were basically a panel of industry experts, and their recommendation to the Obama administration in 2009 was to cancel the Constellation program, which is what ended up happening. There were valid reasons for doing this, but it also left NASA in a really bad pickle because the space shuttle was set to retire in 2011. The space shuttle was our only crew-rated vehicle or human-rated vehicle that could launch astronauts. The Orion capsule was supposed to replace the shuttle for both low Earth orbit missions and then also these moon missions. And now we were left without a replacement, which meant that from 2011, when the shuttle retired, through 2020, we were actually forced to purchase seats on Soyuz vehicles from Russia at about $50 million a head. So that's what ended up happening there. This seems like a pretty bad situation for NASA. At the time, the public opinion was such that people thought, oh, is NASA like getting disbanded? Is it all over? Have we completely given up on the space program? Wasn't quite that drastic, but it was a bad situation. So they had to figure out what to do about it. Ultimately, the US Congress ended up stepping in. And they said, oh, okay, we understand why we canceled the Constellation program, but this was kind of short-sighted for a lot of reasons. So is there anything that we can do to try to repair this? And so ultimately, Congress salvaged the Orion program. They said, Orion's far enough along and is having relatively few issues. Let's keep going with that. And the Ares rocket was kind of considered a lost cause. So they said, let's start over with a new clean sheet rocket design. And that became the SLS, or Space Launch System, which is the rocket that's used for the Artemis program. So in 2011, the US Senate essentially ordered by law NASA to start developing this rocket. SLS, or as my friends in Alabama when I was working on this program called it, the ASLS, is not a very imaginative name for a rocket. It is the Space Launch System. Sometimes I wish we could be a little more creative. Immediately though, because the Senate had ordered this to be designed, the joke became that it was the Senate Launch System. So there's jokes here and there about what this vehicle really is about. Somebody can let them in, that would be great, thank you. So that's the story of how SLS came to be. Now, another question that I get a lot is, where are these commercial providers in all of this, like SpaceX, right? Because they're a very, very powerful force in the industry right now. Back in 2011, when this happened, that really wasn't the case yet. So SpaceX was just getting started. I think the company was started in 2002, so they did exist at the time, but they really hadn't become a major force in the industry yet at that point. Where those commercial providers did come in is through another program called Commercial Crew. So at the same time that SLS development started, NASA said, okay, we want to have capability to send people to the ISS. We don't want to have to keep relying on the Soyuz forever. We got to come up with some solution for this. And so they actually issued contracts to Boeing and to SpaceX to independently develop crew vehicles to get astronauts to the ISS. And that was a separate program from this whole SLS Orion project. What was funny about it at the time was that Boeing was considered the sure bet, and SpaceX was considered the risky option of the two. As history would have it, the SpaceX vehicle has now been in service since 2020 and has had over a dozen successful missions under its belt, and the Boeing project has been kind of a disaster. So you never know, and this is why NASA was trying to hedge its bets with two providers. So that's typically what they try to do. There's differences in the contracting structure here too. So SLS Orion is a traditional government contracting program, whereas Commercial Crew has a major difference in that the vehicles are actually owned and operated by the commercial providers, and NASA essentially buys tickets on those vehicles. So that's the difference there, which means that theoretically, they're free to actually sell those services to other people. So there's been several missions on the SpaceX Dragon vehicle that are private astronaut missions that were not actually through the government. So interesting twist there. So we'll run a little bit through the design of the SLS, and then we'll be off to the races with this mission. So the biggest piece of the SLS is the core stage here, and this is responsible for getting most of the mission accomplished. So getting to Earth orbit takes about 8 minutes, and this part of the rocket fires for that entire time. So this gets everything up to Earth orbit. If you guys remember the space shuttle, and I'll show you a picture in a minute that kind of compares the two. This probably looks familiar because it looks like that orange tank that's behind the space shuttle when it's taking off. Not a coincidence. So one of the rules around the SLS program was to have maximum reuse of space shuttle hardware and production equipment. So they deliberately made the external tank of the space shuttle into the core stage, same exact diameter so it can use the same tooling and same production line. Instead of having the engines mounted on the bottom of the orbiter like they were for the space shuttle, the engines are just moved to the bottom of the core stage. Then there's these two solid rocket boosters. These provide the majority of the thrust when the vehicle is taking off from the ground, but they only fire for about 2.5 minutes. So they're kind of there for a boost at the beginning of the flight. And then above that, we have this thing here with the very, very exciting and inspiring name of the Interim Cryogenic Propulsion Stage. They called it this because they were planning to design a different, more powerful upper stage later, and this was kind of a stopgap. The different, more powerful upper stage has now been canceled. So the interim cryogenic propulsion stage is the upper stage. It will still be replaced later with a new commercial alternative called the Centaur, but I'll get into that later. Above that is the actual Orion capsule, which carries the crew. So the irony is of all this whole thing, you see there's that little silver cone-shaped thing that's the second to the top element in this picture. That's the only part that came back today for the splashdown. Everything else gets discarded over the course of the flight, which is pretty crazy. And then if you look at this, this is kind of a litany of major classic defense contractors. So the prime contractor for core stage is Boeing. Prime contractor for the boosters is Northrop Grumman. Prime contractor for the Orion capsule is Lockheed Martin. And then the prime contractor for the service module is Airbus. So that is the European Space Agency's contribution. So it is still an international project. The engines on the core stage came from Aerojet Rocketdyne, which I believe is now owned by L3 Harris. And then the upper stage came from a company called United Launch Alliance, which is a joint venture of Boeing and Lockheed. So basically all the sort of old space companies are involved in the construction of this rocket. A little bit of the stats here. So SLS is the most powerful operational rocket ever. So there have been 2 rockets that have surpassed it in first stage power. One of them is the Soviet N-1 rocket, which never successfully launched. It blew up all 4 times that they tried to launch it. The other one is the SpaceX Starship, which is not fully operational yet. It is still in the prototyping stage. They have launched it 11 times, and as I recall, out of those 11 times, there have been issues with, I think, 9 or 10 of them. So they're still working through the bugs on that vehicle. And they have a very different philosophy related to testing, which we can get into later if you're interested. But in terms of vehicles that have actually carried people or cargo to orbit successfully, SLS is the most powerful with 8.8 million pounds of thrust. That is equivalent to 200 F-18s at full afterburn. So if anybody has sort of aviation background, that's just sort of a stat to give you a feel for that. Payload to low Earth orbit is 95,000 kilograms, which is the most heaviest duty current rocket. The Saturn V, which was the Apollo era rocket, actually has slightly higher payload capacity. But SLS, although it is more powerful from the first stage because of fuel efficiency with the solid rocket boosters, is actually slightly lower capability to low Earth orbit. Payload to something called translunar injection, which is not a cosmetic procedure. It is how you get to the moon. It is about 27,000 kilograms, and then we don't need to run through all these other numbers, but just kind of gives you a sense of the scale of this vehicle. Mentioned there's a shuttle flight heritage, so it's pretty direct. You can see it in this picture. And for the first 4 SLSs that are launching, it's really a direct heritage. So these 4 engines on the core stage, the RS-25 main engines, were literally taken off the back of the shuttles when they retired. So it's not just that they're the same model of engine, they are the engines from the shuttles. Same deal with the SRBs. So the solid rocket boosters were also taken off of the shuttles, repaired, and then put onto the SLS. So they tried to reuse as much stuff as humanly possible. The only difference is that the SLS solid rocket boosters have an extra segment, which makes them slightly more powerful, and then they can also burn a little bit longer. But because they're modular, they could reassemble them from shuttle components. So that's what we're seeing there. How big is the SLS? I tried to pick something we'd all be familiar with. So this is a true scale comparison of Statue of Liberty, Hoover Tower, and SLS. So SLS is 322 feet tall, which is actually slightly shorter than the Apollo Saturn V rocket, but it is still pretty big. So if you can imagine something a little bit taller than the Hoover Tower taking off, that's what we're talking about. This picture recently of Artemis 2 on the pad with Jared Isaacman, who is the NASA administrator, also gives you a sense of the scale involved here. So pretty big. A little bit more about the boosters. So these boosters are the most powerful single rocket motor ever to fly. A strange convention in the space industry is if it is a liquid-powered rocket engine, it's called an engine. If it is a solid-powered rocket motor, it is called a motor. Don't ask me why, but that is a convention. These are manufactured in Promontory, Utah, and then they are transported by rail to Florida, where they are stacked onto the vehicle. And an interesting fact that comes out of this is that the diameter of the rocket is fixed by the height of the lowest rail bridge between Utah and Florida. So that's how they figured out this design parameter. That in turn was partially driven by the gauge of the rails themselves, which in turn is actually driven by the width of a Roman chariot with 4 horses in front of it. So this shows how design features echo through the ages. The width of a horse in ancient Rome has affected the design of this rocket. Kind of crazy. And then this is more about the core stage. The core stage has 5 major elements in it. These all get joined together. I'll show you how that process works. There are 733,000 gallons of fuel carried in this core stage. One thing about SLS that's kind of unique compared to a lot of other rockets in the industry is this uses liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen fuel. SpaceX's rockets use either kerosene or liquid methane fuel. Hydrogen is the most fuel-efficient rocket fuel in the world. That's why it was chosen for SLS, and that's because the hydrogen atoms weigh the least, and so they can get all the energy with less mass. The problem is it's also not very dense compared to a lot of other rocket fuels, and that's why the stage has to be so physically large in order to accommodate all this fuel. The other thing that makes it difficult to work with is that it has to be super cool to cryogenic temperatures, very close to absolute zero, for it to be stored in a liquid form. And so that also makes things a little bit more complicated and harder to work with. So this is the temperature here, negative 423 degrees Fahrenheit for the fuel. There's two fuel tanks here. So this one, the lower tank is where the hydrogen is stored. The upper tank is the oxygen. So aircraft do not have to carry oxidizer because, I think somebody can look at it. Thanks. Aircraft don't have to carry oxidizer for their engines because they're always flying through the atmosphere. So they pull in oxygen from the atmosphere. That is then used to combust the fuel, and then that's great. But a rocket eventually flies outside of the atmosphere into the medium of space where there is no oxygen, so it has to carry the oxygen itself, and that's what's going on in this tank. Because of differential density, the oxygen tank actually weighs 6 times as much as the hydrogen tank, even though it's physically smaller. So kind of weird things that kind of mess with your head. One more infographic. This is about the RS-25 engine. What was originally called the Space Shuttle main engine is now just called the RS-25. This is what powers the core stage. There are 4 of them. Each one of these has about 500,000 pounds of thrust, so it adds up to about 2 million total for the core stage. These are manufactured in Canoga Park, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles, and then that gets moved all the way across the country to be assembled at the Michoud Assembly Facility in Louisiana. You can see it compared to like a Volkswagen up at the top. So this is actually considered a medium-sized rocket engine, but it's still pretty big compared to the Volkswagen. Here's the upper stage, the ICPS, or interim cryogenic propulsion stage. This is the same as the upper stage of the Delta IV Heavy rocket, which has now been retired. But they had a few left over in stock, and so that was used for SLS. There is now, after this mission, exactly one of these left in stock, and so NASA is going to use that for a future Artemis mission, and then after that it will be replaced with a different commercial upper stage called Centaur, which is currently used on another rocket called the Vulcan. So a little complicated, but all these rockets are kind of related to each other. So this is a national effort. This is the location of contractor companies involved in the production of SLS. There were 1,100 contracting companies that are involved in the construction process in all 50 states and Puerto Rico. There's a few reasons for this. Does anybody want to guess why that is? Yes?
Congressional funding.
Yes. So if they can spread out the production process across all the states, then all of the Congress people from those states will vote to continue the project. That's also the reason why all of NASA's 10 field centers are spread out to different states as well. It would be much more efficient to have all of NASA's operations co-located in one place, but they won't get the votes that way, so they are spread out all over the place. The only reason why Mission Control is in Houston, where I used to live, is because LBJ was from Texas. And he was like, I want Mission Control to be in Texas. It would make sense to have everything at Cape Canaveral. That is the only NASA facility that is scientifically located. So you want to have your launch facility on the East Coast so that you can launch eastwards, taking advantage of the Earth's rotation. And you also want to have it as close to the equator as possible, which also takes maximum advantage of the Earth's rotation. So that is why Europe's launch site is in French Guiana in South America. That's actually the best location for a major launch site in the world. Florida was the best we could do in the continental United States. So that's why Cape Canaveral launch facility is located where it is. A little bit more about Orion. So this was the home of our astronauts on Artemis II. The Orion capsule looks very similar to the Apollo capsule, but it's a little bit bigger. So in the Apollo era, they would carry 3 people. This time we carry 4 people, and the overall interior volume is about 60% bigger. It's still only equivalent to about 2 7-passenger minivans in terms of its interior volume. So not a lot of space for the crew. There's a lot of different pieces here. I'll try to be succinct. So this section here is the service module. This provides the propulsion, the oxygen, the life support, all this other stuff. That's produced by Airbus. The engine here is actually also pulled off of the space shuttle. So that was the engine on the shuttle that was used for retro rocket firing to go back into the atmosphere. It was called the Orbital Maneuvering System, or OMS. They are reusing that for this as well. This is the actual crew compartment here with the 4 windows. So that's where the astronauts were able to look out and see all these cool views from the mission. This thing up here is called the Launch Abort System, or LAS. This has a really cool job. So if something goes wrong and the rocket's about to blow up, this engine fires and physically drags the capsule off the top of the rocket and away before the rocket blows up. So it has to be able to operate on a moment's notice and operate very quickly. This gets discarded after the vehicle reaches space. So it's only there for the beginning of the flight. This is kind of the back view. You can see that engine a little bit better. And then a key difference between Orion and the Apollo era vehicles is that Orion has solar panels. Apollo had hydrogen fuel cells. So 2 different approaches to the same problem. It's kind of 6 of one, half dozen of the other, but the solar panels are a lighter solution, and so it worked out for for Orion. The joke here is because there are 4 of them in an X shape, for any Star Wars fans in the audience, this is a real X-Wing compared to the fictional version. This is what it looks like on the inside. It's a little cluttered. So I have a friend of mine who is a professional closet organizer, and she has told me that she desperately wants to go on this vehicle and do something. But you can kind of see what the environment is like inside the Orion. It's a cone shape, so the walls taper as you get close to the top. Every crevice is packed with some piece of equipment, and there's not a lot of creature comforts. With one notable exception, unlike Apollo, Orion has a private bathroom, which is a big deal. In the Apollo era, they had to use these things called Apollo bags, which you can kind of use your imagination how that would work. Unfortunately, on this flight, the toilet had a few issues, but they were able to work through those and resolve those, and so that is a luxury feature compared to previous vehicles. Also an upgrade over Gemini. So Gemini was the first multi-person spacecraft that the US produced. It would carry 2 people, and you basically had a seat, and that was your space in the Gemini capsule. And the longest duration Gemini flight was 14 days. So you can imagine that was a rough ride for the world. One of the other questions they get a lot is how much did all of this cost, which is a legitimate question. I'll preface this by saying that NASA, let me throw this out as a guess. Does anybody know what percentage of federal spending goes to NASA every year? Sure.
1%?
It's actually a little bit lower than that, yeah.
0.3.
Yeah, there it is, okay, yeah. Reading comprehension, okay. 0.3% of federal spending goes to NASA, which is not that much. NASA's annual budget is about $24 billion. By comparison, the defense budget is between $800 and $900 billion every year. In next year's budget request, not to get too political, the defense budget has increased to $1.5 trillion, and NASA's budget has decreased to $18 billion. That has not been sort of approved by Congress yet. They tried to do the same thing last year, and Congress fully funded the agency at the previous year's levels. So I suspect that that budget cut will not actually happen, but you never know. So they did all of this on what is a comparatively shoestring budget. And actually, if you look at inflation adjustment, developing SLS actually took less than half of the cost that it took to develop the Saturn V vehicle for Apollo. So this was a relatively cost-effective program. That's not to say it is as cheap as it could be. SLS has come under a lot of criticism for how expensive it is per flight. Part of that is because currently the flight rate is very low. They're trying to increase the flight rate. So one of these launches is estimated to cost about $4 billion, which is ridiculous. So everybody agrees that that's a problem and we need to do something to fix it. But they are working on finding ways to make that cheaper. But considering that this was spread out over a long development cycle and it was never considered a crash national priority, they did a pretty good job of keeping things relatively cost conscious. One other thing to remember is that when Apollo was happening, it was considered a major national priority. So in 1965, NASA received 4% of federal spending. So this still doesn't sound like a lot, but compared to 0.3%, it's a much larger chunk of the pie. So that's a little bit about how much all this costs. Commercial rockets do tend to be significantly cheaper. So there's a lot of discussion about how to include commercial rockets in the program going forward. Now we'll just really quickly run through the construction process and then we'll get into the actual missions. So this is how the rocket is manufactured. They use a process called friction stir welding, which is really cool because they use this drill bit that essentially fuses the metal together without actually melting it, and there's no like arc welding or sparks or anything like that. It's kind of trippy. So that's how this works. These are people inside the fuel tank working on it, so it kind of gives you a sense of the scale of how big all this stuff is. This is all done at a facility called the Michoud Assembly Facility in Louisiana, just outside of New Orleans. This is the same building where they built the Apollo moon rockets and the same building where they built the space shuttle tanks. So they kind of kept the same facilities. And in fact, the roof height of this facility was the limiting factor on the Saturn V design. So infrastructure has a lot of impact on these design decisions. They put this stuff on called TPS, or thermal protection system. It's this spray-on foam. Initially, it's this kind of buttercream yellow color, and then the more it's exposed to sunlight, it turns into this burnt orange color. So that's why SLS looks orange. That's just the natural color of this foam. And it basically helps the fuel tank act like a thermos bottle and regulate the temperature of the fuel inside. Eventually, all these different pieces are joined together in this process called the tank join. That's what that looks like. Some of it's done vertically, some of it's done horizontally. This is all inside that facility. The final piece that goes on is the engine section. Initially, this was also done at Michoud. Now it's done on premises at Cape Canaveral. That's actually the most complicated part, is the engine section, because that's where all the plumbing is located. Then the engines go on one by one. You can kind of see, I think this person here, so you get a sense for the scale of all of this, pretty big. The vehicle we're seeing pictures of here is actually the Artemis 1 SLS, which looks functionally identical to the Artemis 2 SLS, but this is what that whole rollout process looks like. They had a high school marching band show up for the rollout. They wanted to kind of make it fun. At the same time, in preparation for Artemis 1, which was the 2022 mission that was a uncrewed test flight of SLS with nobody on board, they did this whole dynamic test process. This was intentional. They were trying to crush the rocket like a soda can to figure out how much force it could take before it burst. And this was within the limits that they were expecting it to be, so it did better than they thought it would in terms of resisting that force. This is the process for stacking the solid rocket boosters. We don't need to go into a ton of detail on that. This is what that looks like inside the VAB. So the VAB is the Vehicle Assembly Building, which is at Cape Canaveral. This is the world's largest single room. So it's so large that there's actually weather patterns that form inside the building, and sometimes it rains inside the VAB because clouds form up at the ceiling. Crazy. The SLS-1 went through something called the Green Run Test Fire Campaign, so that's what that looked like. They put it on top of this test stand in Mississippi at the Stennis Space Center and fired the engines for a full duration burn of what it would take to get to orbit. That was just to check it out, make sure everything was working properly. They had a number of key test objectives that they ran through. This whole process took about a year, so this was a long test campaign. Finally, they started doing the core stage stacking. Like I said, these are Artemis 1 pictures, but the process is the same for Artemis 2. So you can get a sense of the scale of this room. The core stage, the orange part up at the top, is 212 feet tall, and it is getting hoisted up and over the launch pad and then lowered down onto the launch pad by a crane inside a room. So that's how big that room is. The American flag that is painted on the side of the vehicle assembly building is 42 stories tall. This is the stacking process for ICPS and Orion. This is kind of what that looks like. And then finally, they had a fully assembled moon rocket, and that's what it looks like inside the garage, essentially. This was an exciting moment for us who were working on the program at various times because we'd seen a lot of like CGI renderings of the vehicle, but when we finally saw actual photos, it was like, oh, look, it's real. So that was pretty cool. SLS goes through something called the wet dress rehearsal every time it launches, and basically they take it out to the launch pad. It sounds weird, but basically what they're doing is they fully fill the rocket with fuel, and they make sure that all the plumbing is working properly, and they take it all the way down to when they would press the button to launch it, and then they don't actually press the button. So they have to do that a couple times usually. This was sort of a visual showing that finally, 50 years after the last Apollo mission, we had restored the capability to send people to the moon. It took a long time, but we finally did it, and you can see the overall technology doesn't look that different. It's pretty similar setup between the two vehicles. This isn't quite to scale. The Saturn V is a little bit bigger. But that's what it looked like. I actually went out to see it on the launch pad, so I got this very, very zoomed in picture from my phone. I wanted to see the launch. I went with my family and my best friend, and we actually camped out on the coast of Florida to watch Artemis 1. And we stayed overnight, and then they canceled the flight 30 minutes before it was supposed to go. It finally did launch on November 16th of 2022. This was a night launch, which is always very dramatic. So like I mentioned, Artemis 1 was a uncrewed test flight that was basically designed to check out all the systems before we put anybody inside, which is pretty important. Although, alarmingly, this was the first time we'd actually done this. All other prior human spaceflight vehicles for the US had their first flight with people on board. So we're being a little more careful now, especially considering that the first 3 rockets that we used for Mercury and Gemini were converted nuclear missiles. That's a little bit of a close-up of what the launch process looks like. The RS-25 main engines look like they're not on, but that's because the hydrogen has a clear blue flame, so you actually can't see the flame, but they are on. The solid rocket motors are much more dramatic. Then the stage separation happens. This is when the upper stage detaches from the rest of the rocket to send the crew into orbit and then eventually to the moon. This was the mission map for Artemis 1. Artemis 1 was actually a slightly longer mission than Artemis 2 because the Orion capsule did actually enter lunar orbit, unlike Artemis 2, which was just a round back and then come back to Earth situation. This is a cool photo that Orion got as a selfie from one of its wing-mounted cameras. So we got the Earth and the Moon in the background, and that's how far out it was. So pretty cool picture. A few more stats, which we don't need to run through all the numbers here. But like I said, this was the precursor flight in 2022. Cool feature of this flight, this is Charlie Blackwell Thompson. So she's the flight director for Artemis. She ran both the first mission and then this mission as well. And she is NASA's first woman flight director. So another historic first for the program. These guys, the red crew, saved the mission because they almost didn't launch on November 16th because there was a leak in the hydrogen fueling system. These guys went out to the pad next to the fully fueled rocket and like wrenched on the valve to get it to close properly. And then they went back. And so that was pretty brave. So these guys got special recognition. A little bit about, before we get into Artemis 2, which is kind of the next and final section of the presentation, just a little walk in memory lane. So I had a very small role to play in all of this stuff, but the part that I worked on was this thing here, which has a complete mouthful of a name. This is the Liquid Hydrogen Tail Service Mast Umbilical Flight Side Plate. And what that is essentially the fuel filling system. So if you're at the gas pump, right, and you put the gas pump in your car, that's essentially what's going on here. But the difference is that when the rocket launches, this has to very quickly pull back and then retract into this gray tower. And so they need to make sure that all this fits together properly. And so what my responsibility as the intern was to prepare something called the interface control drawing. And so that was a drawing that kind of pointed out all the different features on the plate, how they all fit together, what the different electrical connections were. And to my horror, in both Artemis 1 and Artemis 2, this system experienced issues during the run-up to the launch. And I'm like, uh-oh. And I'm thinking, okay, the headlines write themselves, intern doomed. Fortunately, they were able to resolve those problems and continue. And part of it was because hydrogen is difficult to work with. The atoms love to escape through the smallest possible leak path. And so that was the issue as opposed to a design flaw. But that's what that was. A few photos from back in the day. Our intern squad got to go to the Nishu assembly facility to see some of the tooling and the rockets under construction. We also got to see the engines before they were put on the rocket, so you can kind of get a sense of scale of the engine behind us there. And we also got to tour the dynamic test stand facility. So fun stuff from 8 years ago. All right, now we're going to run into Artemis 2. So that's why we're here tonight. This is this week's big event. So this is our crew. We're going to meet more of them in a second. But Artemis 2 is the first crewed return to the moon, like I said, since 1972. So pretty big deal. This is the crew. We had 4 astronauts from the United States and Canada. So this was a team effort. The commander of the mission was Reed Wiseman. He's a former naval aviator who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. He then became an astronaut in 2013, and he was on ISS Expedition 40/41. These ISS missions are typically 6-month rotations on the station, with some exceptions. And then he was the head of the NASA's astronaut office until 2023 when they put him back up to active duty to run this mission, which I'm sure was an exciting moment for him. We also have Victor Glover. Victor Glover is another former naval aviator who also served in Iraq. And then he was on ISS Expedition 64/65. He was the first African American to serve a long duration ISS mission. So a lot of firsts for Victor Glover, and he's also the first person of color to travel to the moon. Christina Cook is an astrophysicist. She was in Antarctica for 3.5 years with the U.S. Antarctic Program. She also worked for Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory and for the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration before becoming an astronaut. She served on Expedition 59, 60, 61. This means she was actually on the station for a longer rotation. She was on the station for, I think, 328 days, which is the longest duration spaceflight by a woman. And now she's also the first woman to travel to the moon. She also participated in the first all-woman spacewalk, so she's a real pioneer. And then we have Jeremy Hansen. He's the only sort of rookie astronaut of the crew who has not flown to space previously, but he flew F-18s or CF-18s for the Royal Canadian Air Force, and then was selected for this mission. A little joke, when they first selected the crew, I thought Jeremy Hansen kind of looks like the animated Buzz Lightyear, so kind of fun. This is the mission profile for Artemis 2, so a little bit simpler than Artemis 1. They're basically doing a big figure 8 around the moon and coming back. And the idea here is to just test out all the systems of the vehicle, make sure everything's working properly. But in the course of doing this, their trajectory actually took them farther away from Earth than any spacecraft previously. So those 4 people have gone farther away from Earth than anyone in history, which is pretty cool. And they just got back like 2 hours ago. This is a infographic kind of showing all the different steps of the mission. So you can see as SLS takes off and then the boosters separate, core stage gets you up there. Then the upper stage fires to put you into what's called the translunar injection maneuver that gets you to the moon. Fly around the back of the moon, and then this is the part that just happened with the recovery with the parachutes. They then get picked up by a helicopter in mid-ocean, and now they're on the ship. So pretty exciting. So it's just some pictures to kind of show you how this all works. So this is the rollout to the pad. So everything is stacked on this thing called the crawler transporter inside that garage building, the vehicle assembly building. Then this rolls out at the blistering speed of 1 mile an hour to the launch pad. But this is a tracked vehicle. So it's like the world's biggest tracked vehicle, kind of crazy. So that goes out to the pad. It's on the pad for a while. I thought that was kind of a dramatic picture. They're getting ready for the launch. Launch actually happens. There's a lot of great videos of this. If you search up Artemis 2 launch, you'll find all kinds of different angles of this launch. The little arrow pointing here, that's the little plate that I was involved with. So I was like, oh, you can see it. So that was cool. This is a cool picture. So there were a few moments of this were like America moments. This is a bald eagle watching the launch from a nearby telephone pole. So that was pretty cool. Another, American picture. Just other views of, again, you can see that the flames from the main engines are not really visible, but they are firing in this picture. Rocket continues to ascend. It gets going pretty quickly, especially with the solid rocket boosters. They fire and it really goes. Then the boosters separate. That's what that looks like. You can see the 4 main engines are continuing to fire. You can see them as glowing points of light. Boosters separate. Then the upper stage separates from the lower stage. And once all of this happens, the astronauts finally get a chance to look out the window, and this is what they see. So pretty spectacular views from inside the spacecraft. When this picture was released, I'm not sure why this got so much traction, because this is not the first picture we've seen like this of the Earth, but apparently the flat Earth people were really upset when this picture came out. Then after the translunar injection maneuver, they got this really cool picture of the Earth as they were leaving. This is an interesting shot. This was a long exposure picture, so this was actually taken at night. So if it looks a little muted, that's why. This is actually not the daylit side of the Earth. So the only light source here is actually from the moon reflecting the sunlight back onto the Earth over this long exposure. You can see here that there's this sort of extra line, and that is the boundary of the atmosphere. So you can actually see the atmosphere backlit from the sun from behind. And here, and also at the top of the planet up there, you can see auroras. So pretty cool photo. This is a little trippy in terms of what we're actually looking at. This is the west part of Africa, and this is Spain. So we're not looking at Earth in the orientation that we usually see. It's kind of upside down. But that's what we're looking at here. So pretty cool. This is a selfie of the Orion taken en route to the moon from one of those wing-mounted cameras. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
You said upside down. Why is it upside down?
So upside down relative to our frame of reference of how we normally look at maps, but in space there's really no up or down. And so that's something that is a little hard for some people to wrap their head around. But yeah, like north would be kind of that way.
Right. For the
Yeah.
Apollo 17 mission, they rotated the image because it was originally south.
Yeah.
And there is this south and north bias, that goes around. Why did NASA do that? Was there any discussion about not rotating this one to feed the bias?
It's a great question. So the question was there discussion about rotating this image to be more like in line with what we expect to see looking at the Earth based on map biases? I'm not aware of a discussion about that, but I think what they did was they just sent back what they saw and hopefully trusted audiences to be able to interpret what they were seeing. But that's a great point that you make about kind of our assumptions and our biases and how they color how we look at the world. And the fact that this kind of challenged some of that was an interesting aspect of this mission. There were a lot of relatable moments from this mission, and there were a few minor issues. Overall, everything worked pretty well, but early on in the mission, the toilet got backed up. And so, although it was an innovation to have a private bathroom on the vehicle, there were a few issues that came along with that. And then they apparently also had issues with Outlook and Teams. So, it happens to the best of us, apparently. But a lot of people were remarking that if that's the worst thing that happens, and they were able to fix the toilet, by the way, that was not a permanent problem. Shortly, a few days into the flight, so it typically takes about three to 4 days to reach the moon. On April 6th, so this past Monday, is when they broke the distance record set by Apollo 13. So at this point, Artemis 2 is 406,764 kilometers away from Earth. That is the farthest that any astronauts have ever traveled. Prior to that, it was not that far off. It was about 400,000 from Apollo 13, but it's a little bit farther. And this is a picture taken showing the moon kind of while the vehicle is en route. What was really cool about this mission, and what I wasn't really expecting going into this, honestly, was there were a lot of very emotional moments in this mission. So one thing I didn't know about until it was widely reported during this mission is that Commander Reed Wiseman's wife, Carol, passed away in 2020 after a courageous battle with cancer. She was a neonatal intensive care nurse. And the rest of the crew decided to name a crater on the surface of the moon that's visible from Earth at certain times. They named it the Carol crater in honor of her. They did that shortly after, just a couple of minutes after passing that distance boundary. So that was a very emotional moment for the crew. So Reed Wiseman has 2 teenage daughters, and he's been raising them as a single dad for the last 6 years. So they were there for the launch. They were present in mission control when the crater was named after their mom. And he also wore a friendship bracelet that they gave him throughout the course of the flight. So that was really sweet. Another really special surprise was that I think the next day of the mission, the crew always has a wake-up message that comes in from NASA. This time around, the wake-up message was from Jim Lovell. Jim Lovell was the astronaut who was the commander of Apollo 8, which was a very similar mission to this one in terms of its trajectory, and then also of Apollo 13. And he passed away last year. But apparently, shortly before he passed away, he left a recorded message for this crew, which was a surprise that they played for them as their wake-up message on that day of the mission. So that was pretty cool. Apollo 8 was famous for this photo called Earthrise, which they sent back, and this was really the first time that we'd seen something like this coming back from a space mission. 1968 was a pretty tumultuous year. Most of us weren't here for it, but there were a lot of things going on. We had the Vietnam War, we had a lot of unrest in the US, we had other things going on worldwide. And so the Apollo 8 mission was a remarkably peaceful moment that kind of refocused people on what was really important, and this Earthrise message was part of it. The other thing that the Apollo 8 crew did that was pretty special was they did a reading from Genesis on Christmas Eve. This was kind of a off-the-script moment. They weren't really supposed to do this, but they decided to do it anyway. And I guess they decided no one was going to stop them where they were. And so that was a remarkably peaceful moment as well that a lot of people appreciated. So kind of in honor of all of that, because this mission happened to be on Easter, Victor Glover did a similar message that included sort of a spiritual, inspirational theme for Easter. And they also sent back this picture, which is very similar to the Earthrise picture. So there's a lot of parallels, and as I'm sure we all know, 2026 has been kind of an interesting year so far too in terms of issues both domestically and abroad. And so there's a lot of striking parallels between Apollo 8 in 1968 and Artemis 2 in 2026. Another cool picture of the Earth. This is actually an Earth set picture, so this is the Earth is receding behind the surface of the moon as the vehicle is passing around. This is kind of the text of Victor Glover's Easter message. I won't read the whole thing, but you can look it up and hear what he said. There were some silly moments too. So Nutella got some great product placement in this mission because this Nutella jar was floating around the whole time, and so a lot of people were commenting about that. And then for one of Victor Glover's messages, he just got spammed with 6-7 messages in the group chat, and everyone's like, "You gotta love humanity. You know, we got this historic mission, and this is what people say." But overall, the public response to this mission has been overwhelmingly positive. I think a lot of people realized we needed something inspirational right now. And I've been impressed that a lot of people have been paying attention to this. I think a lot of the people working at NASA were concerned that this program had not had a very big public profile up until this point. A lot of people didn't even know we were going back to the moon. And so there was concern there might be kind of a muted public reaction, but there's been a lot of buzz about it. Another cool picture that they sent back, this is an eclipse photo of the sun behind the moon. And then these 2 stars here are actually other planets in our solar system. So kind of a cool picture. I think one of them is Mars, I don't remember which one. But that was kind of a cool shot. And then also people have noticed that they keep panning back to mission control every so often. And you might notice there's a lot of women in mission control. And so Artemis 2 has been a really big moment for women in STEM between Christina Koch's inclusion in the crew and her accomplishments, as well as all the people behind the scenes who are helping make this mission possible. And overall, the crew has kind of captured everybody's imagination with just how caring and supportive they are of each other and showing their emotions and just being there for each other. And the fact that it's a joint US-Canadian mission has really demonstrated what we can accomplish when we work together with international partners and we set aside differences and all the other silly stuff that's going on down here. This is the most recent picture. This picture I got as a screen grab about 2 hours ago. So the vehicle has now landed in the Pacific Ocean just off the coast of San Diego. Recovery process is actually a little complicated. So after the parachutes deploy and the re-entry process happens, there's about a 6-minute window where the crew cannot communicate with the ground because of the high temperature plasma that's surrounding the vehicle during the re-entry process. Once that happens, they're able to reestablish communication with mission control. Vehicle then splashes down in the Pacific, and then it is picked up by this vessel here called the USS John P. Murtha, which is a San Antonio class landing platform dock ship of the US Navy. This ship has a well deck in the back, which means that they can actually just grab this and sort of scoop it into the back of the ship to be carried off. But before that happens, they have to get the crew out. So what happens is, they were actually in here for about an hour and a half, which was longer than I was expecting, and it was kind of bobbing around, which I'm sure wasn't very comfortable. But then it's surrounded by all these boats with US Navy divers. They come in, they help secure the vehicle, they get the hatch open, they put this inflatable thing in front of it called the front porch. The crew then gets out onto the front porch, and then these 2 helicopters come in from the John P. Murtha. They looked like Seahawks. I wasn't totally sure, but I think they were Seahawks. They come in, they pick up the astronauts, they then get flown back to the ship. And so these poor astronauts have to go from being in 0 gravity to then being in a bobbing boat type thing to then being hoisted into a hovering helicopter and then flown onto a ship. So there's a lot going on in a very brief period of time. But the flight surgeons have all confirmed that they're all in good health and they're doing well. The announcement that they made was that they were green, and CNN had to clarify that that meant they weren't like green in complexion, but were instead all good in terms of their health. So last piece of the puzzle here is what's next. So like I said, this was a test flight. This was just the beginning. NASA just announced actually a couple weeks ago that the plan is to build a permanent lunar base on the lunar South Pole, similar to an Antarctic research station. So that's what they're trying to accomplish next. There's several key pieces of technology that will enable that. This is kind of where we're going next. So in 2026, that was Artemis 2, and then 2027 is supposed to be Artemis 3. The plan there is to have a Earth orbit rendezvous with one of the lander vehicles to just kind of test out the rendezvous process and making sure they're all working properly. And then the actual landing is supposed to happen in 2028. Now, these schedules tend to slip, so I am not up here promising that either of these missions will happen in these years. It's not a coincidence also that 2028 is an election year. So just bear that in mind. But there are 2 key vehicles that are essential for this, and this is kind of the schedule that they're planning in terms of what's going to get landed when. There's a lot here which we don't need to go into right now. The 2 vehicles that are enabling this are called the Human Landing System, or HLS vehicles, and there's kind of like the Commercial Crew Project. There's 2 different companies doing this. One of them is SpaceX with their lander that's based off of the Starship vehicle. The other one is Blue Origin, which has their Blue Moon lander. The idea is that these launch on separate rockets and then will rendezvous with the Orion capsule in space, and then the crew will go down to the lunar surface in one of these. My personal opinion is that this design seems a lot more realistic than this one. But this one has actually been under development longer, so we'll see what happens. This is generally considered to be oversized for what it needs to be. The only way to get to the surface is actually via an elevator from the top of the vehicle. Whereas this one, the crew cabin is at the bottom and then it can just step down this ladder, so it's a little bit simpler. I think the idea is that this could theoretically carry a lot more cargo, so for later missions, this might enable larger scale efforts than this one could. So there's pros and cons of these different designs. There's been a lot of hemming and hawing in the industry about this. Now it's just kind of the race is on to make sure that they can meet the deadline that's been set in terms of when these missions are supposed to happen. These schedules have already slipped a few times, so we'll see what happens. Last piece of the puzzle here is the spacesuits. So the Artemis EVA, which is extravehicular activity, that means walking around on the surface of the moon. Spacesuits, these are manufactured by a company called Axiom Space, which was my immediate previous employer before coming to GSB. I was not involved in this project. I was on a different side of the business, but they are making these new spacesuits right now, and these will also be tested out on the Artemis 3 mission. So that's where we are. It's been an exciting week for the mission. At this point, it's been a long night. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them, but thank you all for spending time to learn about this.
So it's come up once or twice throughout this presentation. old school NASA versus SpaceX. I would imagine there's also risk differentials that come with that. You almost mentioned like fuel types and all that kind of stuff. It's very different. Can you speak to a little bit like what the potential is for SpaceX being used for this portion of it as well, if that cost differential affects risks, and then if you want some extra spice on there, if the IPO, how those risk and cost decisions come out when it comes to shareholders?
Great question. So the question was SpaceX's involvement with all of this. They have a different philosophy, they have different vehicle designs and a commercial approach. How does that affect the risk of their vehicles and how that might get incorporated into future missions? And then they may be doing an IPO soon, they just filed for it. How does that interact with all of it? Great question. So Artemis is a rare example of a modern space mission with zero SpaceX involvement at this point. So there was no SpaceX stuff on Artemis 2. For later missions like 3 and 4 where that HLS lander is involved, then SpaceX does get involved. So that has led to some friction between the traditional way of doing things versus how SpaceX does stuff. So NASA typically has a very conservative approach to design, to testing. They have this thing called 5-9, so they won't launch unless they are 99.99999% sure nothing's going to go wrong. SpaceX tends to have a more, I'm not going to say cavalier because that's a little harsh, but they have a more loose approach to their testing program, particularly when it's just like a prototype vehicle. They still take things very seriously when there's astronauts involved, and the Dragon capsule has performed very well so far in terms of safety and performance with the astronauts. But my time at NASA, what I could tell was that the traditional engineers there were kind of uncomfortable with SpaceX's approach and a lot of the stuff they were doing. They felt like they were cutting some corners, and that they were kind of rushing through certain things. In some cases, there were parts that were used that were not really aerospace rated, things like that. So I think there's a little bit of nervousness about the HLS program, particularly because the SpaceX lander is dependent on the Starship vehicle to launch it. And then not only that, to get it to the moon after being launched, it has to be refueled in orbit, and that requires as many as 13 to 20 additional Starship launches to send tanker vehicles up to do an on-orbit propellant transfer, which has been done, but not at that scale before. So everybody's concerned about making that work properly in the short time frame that's been presented. The big difference is that the Apollo lunar lander in the 60s went up on the same rocket as the crew capsule. It was all just like a one and done mission. And this is a different process. So there's some concerns about that. The advantage to the SpaceX approach is that they tend to move a lot more quickly than NASA. So the development cycle for SLS took 15 years. So that's a long development cycle. It also took a lot of money. It's about $27 billion to develop SLS. Because SpaceX is a private company, we actually don't know what their financials are in terms of how much it costs them to develop the Starship or their other vehicles, but it has been a quicker process. And they also introduce a lot of new technology. So the SpaceX rockets can do that, they can land themselves, they have all those reusability aspects. SLS is not a reusable vehicle. It's using mostly 1970s era technology upgraded with modern digital electronics. So there are two very different approaches, which we're trying to make work together to put people on the moon. And so there is a tension there for sure. But I think we're hopeful that that will all come together the way that it should. In terms of the IPO, that's a great question. I think everybody's watching that very closely in terms of how that works. They also just merged with Twitter, or X, AI, or whatever they're calling it now. And so that's a very different industry than SpaceX has traditionally been involved with. No one's really sure how that's going to interact, especially in terms of AI companies are spending a lot of money right now without a lot of revenue, and so how does that affect SpaceX's bottom line? If they do go public, it's going to be very interesting to see their actual released financials, because everybody's been very curious for a long time about that. Does that answer your question?
It does.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah.
So the SRB's photo,
Yes.
are we not concerned they'll hit someone on the way down?
That's a great question. So pieces coming off the rocket, are we worried that they hit things? So I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that Cape Canaveral is positioned where it is so that you can launch east. It's also positioned so that you can launch over the Atlantic Ocean and not over a populated area. So most countries have a policy in their space programs that if you launch a rocket that drops stages, you don't do that over any populated area where it could potentially hit somebody. The one exception is China, which does occasionally launch over populated areas. And there was one situation where a Chinese rocket hit a village and killed like 16 people. So that can happen, but for SLS, it's not a concern because they're launching over the Atlantic. In the space shuttle era, these two boosters were actually recovered and refurbished and used again on future flights. They figured out that the process of remediating all of the salt water in these boosters when they're recovered from the ocean was actually more expensive than just making a new one. So for SLS, they're not going to do that recovery and reuse, but they're still not falling over a populated area. And also, if there's boats, so any other vehicles like boats or ships or aircraft, there's like a hazard zone that's declared ahead of time by the agency, and so all vehicles are required to be outside of that hazard zone. Yes?
As getting to orbit becomes exponentially cheaper,
Yeah.
what do you think NASA's budget is going to go to in the further future?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question was, launch costs are coming down through these commercial providers. What is NASA going to be doing going forward? So they've been thinking about that a lot. And NASA is kind of trying to get out of the business of launching stuff to orbit. And so Artemis is a great example of that. So they're trying to turn over low Earth orbit operations to commercial providers and focus their energies on what they call deep space exploration. So deep space is moon's orbit and beyond. So Artemis has always been promoted as what's called a Moon to Mars program. So the idea is that the moon is used as an initial training ground so that we can learn how to live on other heavenly bodies, but then eventually send vehicles and crews to Mars, maybe in the 2030s is the idea. So my last project that I worked on prior to GSB was a commercial space station project with Axiom. And I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that the ISS is supposed to retire in 2030. The hope is that NASA is going to turn over space station operations in Earth orbit to commercial providers, which they will then rent space on, kind of like a shopping mall model almost. And then the idea is instead of spending $3 billion a year to maintain the ISS, which is what they currently do, they can put that money towards Artemis so that we can send people further out and leave sort of commercial and industrial operations in low Earth orbit to the private sector. That's the idea. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering, with this mission, like earlier today, why do they, when the Artemis crew lands, why do they have to go out into these flotation devices and then be airlifted instead of just, like for example with SpaceX, we see them stay in their capsule and then the whole thing is lifted onto a ship,
Yeah.
and then they come out like on a platform. Why do they do this through like an airlift and helicopter?
It's a great question. I'm actually not sure why they use those two different operational approaches. This is very similar to what they did with Apollo. So they're kind of reusing that playbook. So they did the same thing with the helicopters in the Apollo era. That's a good question. I can look into that for you and get back to you. One thing that does happen is when they're coming back from being in zero G for a while, it's actually difficult for the astronauts to handle gravity again, so they can't really stand up on their own when they first get back. It takes a little bit of an adjustment period, so that's why the airlifting happens as opposed to just like climbing onto a boat. Astronauts have said that it takes about as much time to get fully adjusted to gravity as you were in space. So for this crew, it's maybe a week, 10 days, but for astronauts that have been on the ISS for like a year, that's a long process, and so it kind of depends on the situation. Yeah.
Niche question, but did you see which astronaut was physically the furthest during the furthest?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So the question was like, which of the astronauts was like the farthest inside the vehicle from the Earth? I don't think that was tracked, but that's a good question. Yeah.
And then did you see any updates on their speed record? Because they were potentially going to break it, but at last I saw they were like 100 miles per hour short of the fastest humans allowed.
Interesting. I'll have to look into that. I don't know. Good question. Yeah.
You said that the U.S. relied on Russia to fly to space. So first of all, did the war impact any of that? And second of all, generally, does politics affect? You said that it's a very global effort, even Artemis 2.
Yeah.
And does politics affect any of that, or is space really out of the question for that?
Yeah, so the question was like, how do politics on Earth impact space exploration, and was the U.S. cooperation with Russia affected by the war in Ukraine? Yes and no. So there are effects, but they don't really extend to operations. So when the Crimea invasion happened in 2014, a sort of a relic of the Cold War was that in the early 90s, the U.S. made an effort to try to work very closely with the former Soviet space industry, and that's how the ISS came to be. And the reason why was A, they were trying to show that after the Cold War we could all work together and we have a future of cooperation. The other hidden reason for it was there was concern that the Soviet Union's very large group of highly trained engineers could be hired by rogue states to go do nefarious things. And so the idea was that if we give them something to work on that's positive, namely the ISS, then they are occupied and therefore not tempted to go work for North Korea, was the idea. And then also a piece of that was some of the US rockets, namely the Atlas V, which is one of the sort of cornerstones of the US launch capability, started using Russian engines as part of that exchange program. When the Crimea invasion happened in 2014, they realized that that was now a supply chain risk for national security missions, and so ULA, the company that owns Atlas, was directed to begin the development of a new rocket called the Vulcan, which has all US components. But at the same time, they asked the crew on the ISS, which always has both US and Russian astronauts on board, they asked them, like, how do you guys feel about what's going on the planet? You know, is there tension on the station because of this? And they all said no. They said, you know, up here, there's a certain understanding that we kind of leave all of that behind. We're here to support each other. When you're in space, your job is to keep everybody else alive on your vehicle. And they say also that looking down gives you something called the overview effect, where you really get a sense of perspective when you can see the whole Earth in your viewpoint, that all these borders are really arbitrary, and you know, we need to stop beating each other up, essentially. So nowadays there is tensions with Russia over the Ukraine war, but for now the agreements on the ISS have held, so they are still working together. We still do an exchange program where we send one US astronaut up in a Soyuz Russian vehicle every year. They send one Russian cosmonaut up in a US Dragon vehicle every year. We maintained that program even after the war started. And I think, so Russia is not participating in Artemis, but we are still working with them on other things. The US program and the Chinese program do not currently cooperate. I could see maybe that changes in the future. Right now, China has probably the #2 space program in the world after the US. They are very quickly advancing. But yeah, so the short answer to your question is there are some tensions, but space is still kind of considered a sacred territory, and particularly for crew missions where there's people up there, we kind of try to leave all that behind. Yeah.
I'm curious about radiation exposure
Yeah.
for astronauts, especially now that they're going beyond low Earth orbit and I think through the Van Allen belts, and how is that taken into account? And as more will be on the moon and further, like to what degree is it an actual issue versus, I don't know, something that people write about for clicks?
Yeah, so the question was about radiation exposure. So Ari had a really good question that since we're now going out beyond the Van Allen belts and then potentially beyond Earth's magnetic field if we're doing Mars missions, how does that affect radiation exposure? Are we worried about that? How do we mitigate that? It is a real concern. For missions like Apollo and Artemis, it wasn't a long enough duration mission to be a real problem. The actual dosage that they get from these missions, I think, is like similar to what you get from like an X-ray appointment. So it's not a huge deal unless there's a specific event that happens, like a coronal mass ejection or something from the sun that can't be predicted. So in that case, the Orion capsule actually does have, let me see if I can show you, it has what's called a radiation shelter on board. I have to go back here. But the idea is that if there is a real problem like that, the crew can retreat into a more heavily shielded portion of the spacecraft that gives them extra protection against the radiation. There's a lot of slides. Oh, did we pass it already?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we did. Thank you. There we go. Yeah. So you can see these doors down here are basically a locker that you can go into in case of a radiation event where there's additional shielding that will make you safer. It's almost like, for Star Wars fans, they went into those like panels in the Millennium Falcon to hide from the Empire. Very similar idea. Most spacecraft have had some sort of shelter built in like that. For really long duration missions like going to Mars, even just the normal exposure will become a problem for having a really long mission like that. So there's a lot of discussion about how to appropriately shield vehicles for long duration missions. Actually, the best radiation shielding material that you can use is water. So people are saying, well, if you have basically like a shell of the vehicle that's filled with water, you can use that water for, you know, drinking purposes, then it gets recycled, and you can use it for oxygen and all this other stuff, and then it also provides radiation shielding. That's kind of where some people are going. The more sci-fi approach is active shielding, like literally a force field. We're not quite there yet. There are conceptual ideas for it, but they're very power hungry. And so you would need at least a nuclear reactor on your vehicle to power a system like that. But yes, that is a genuine concern. On the ISS, it hasn't been a huge issue because they're protected by the Earth's magnetic field. But for these deeper space missions, it is something we're actively thinking about. Yes?
Speaking of the nuclear stuff, you mentioned that multiple ideas like nuclear propulsion, especially
Yeah.
when it comes to like fuel efficiency for long-term stuff, so we start looking at Mars and beyond.
Yeah.
Have those technical challenges, like feasibilities, actually been like tested, or are they more theoretical? And has anyone ever actually sent nuclear material into space? So I'm thinking like politically that might be difficult to send uranium over at the city.
Yeah, so the question was, like, basically, were they, the conceptual nuclear engines from the 60s, were they just concepts or were they tested? And then has anybody sent fissile material into space? The answer to both of those questions is yes. So the NERVA engine was test fired in the 70s, and it wasn't just a paper project. It worked basically the way they expected it to. It actually exceeded its performance targets. It was well on its way to being integrated into future launch vehicle and spacecraft designs when Nixon pulled the plug on it. So it was working, it was just more of a political issue. I think a lot of people, that was kind of the beginning of the anti-nuclear era, so a lot of people were kind of spooked by the concept. The idea too is that you really wouldn't use nuclear engines in an atmosphere. They would primarily be used for outside of atmosphere applications. Although, my understanding is even those engines don't actually spew anything radioactive, they just use the reactor to heat up the propellant. So it's not like it's a dirty engine, but people hear a nuclear rocket and they freak out. So, I think the idea is that now that those designs have been on the shelf for a long time, now that we're considering using them again for future missions, they're like, oh, well, it worked, so like, let's try it. There's also new technologies that are being worked on. There's one called the Casimir engine, which I'm trying to remember what that all stands for, but it's actually more like a fusion type engine. So there's lots of different nuclear rocket engine concepts out there. They're all pretty intriguing. The other question about have reactors been sent to space or fissile material been sent to space? The Soviet Union did have several nuclear-powered satellites, which they did send up. They're still up there. So they're just kind of hanging out. I think there's a few cases too where some of the molten metal got out and it's like just kind of flying around. So it does occasionally happen. I don't think it was a lot of them. I think it was like half a dozen satellites that they sent up with that reactor design, and I think they were military assets like spy satellites. Thank you. That hasn't been widespread, but it does exist. Then the other piece of the puzzle is that a lot of science missions have used what are called RTGs, and that's a radioisotope thermal generator. That's not an actual nuclear reactor, but it does use decay of radioactive material to generate energy and heat. So our current Mars rovers, Curiosity and Perseverance, on the surface of Mars use those RTG engines, and the Voyager probes that went outside of the solar system also have RTGs on board. The problem with it is that NASA is actually running out of plutonium, and so they can only build a few more of those, and so they're trying to figure out either how to get more plutonium or to conserve their stock. So that's the answer to that. Cool. All right, well, thank you all for coming. I'll stick around for 2 minutes.